Canadian novelist Margaret Atwood once asked a male friend why men were afraid of women. He replied, "We're afraid they'll laugh at us." When she asked women why they were afraid of men, they replied, "We're afraid they'll kill us." The next time you look into the eyes of a newborn baby girl, try to remember that if nothing changes to prevent it, she has a 1 in 5 chance of being raped in her lifetime, and she has a 1 in 4 chance of being the victim of incest. There is a 50% chance of her being physically or sexually abused, and a 1 in 4 chance of being beaten by her spouse. In half the cases, this will be severe enough to need hospital attention. Between 11 and 16 years old, her self-esteem and self-confidence will plunge, and she will have a 1 in 5 chance of becoming pregnant as a single teenager. Between the ages of 18 and 30, if she lives in a large city, she'll be more likely to die of AIDS than of any other cause. Not surprisingly, then, she has a 1 in 4 probability of suffering a bout of serious depression, which in 1 in 16 cases will result in a suicide attempt. Thanks to the work of women's groups in clinics, shelters, and self-help groups, the last 20 years or so has seen a significant improvement in the services available to women once they've been victimized. But the number of women seeking help has not lessened. Despite all the money and effort, the 1990 statistics are virtually identical to those of the 70s. As many women as ever continue to be subjected to the pain and shame of gender violence and exploitation. It's obvious that if we wish to bring an end to the violence and abuse, we must do more than treat the wounded or limit the focus of our efforts to the lives of individual men and women. We must work on prevention. To understand the reasons relationships between women and men so often turn abusive or violent, and to prevent it, we must reach into the very core of the male and female psyche, to the myths, stories, and images that reflect and form our consciousness about women and men. If we as a society are serious about wanting to protect this little girl from being raped and this little boy from becoming a rapist, we must turn our attention to the culture we've created. This program aims at examining those stories to discover the way women and men develop gender identities and learn the relational rules that set up women to become victims and men to become perpetrators of these ever-accelerating statistics of shame. Human beings are storytellers. We tell each other stories about everything, from the origin of the universe to what happened in the checkout line. In fact, what with movies, television, advertising, as well as newspapers, books, telephones, radio, and now faxes and modems, people today live in a world that is just about saturated with stories. Some stories are private, individual tales of comings and goings, but many of the stories we tell are the common property of communities or whole societies. These public stories serve to shape and guide the life of the community and the identities of the people in it. Some of these stories are very ancient, repeated down the generations. Whether told around tribal campfires or across a wide screen, every community has stories which explain the important facts of life. They define who belong to our people and who do not, and they explain why. They account, at least to those on the inside, for why some people are rich and powerful and some not. They include the origin stories, recounting how things began, and they account for the differences between humans and the rest of nature. They also define what it means to be men and women. It is shared acceptance of these communal stories, what are called the myths or the truth stories, that create the psychological glue that holds individuals and cultures together. Stories and myths in a powerful and all-encompassing way, tell us who we are and how we should behave. From the first moment of life, after the midwife or physician says whether it's a girl or a boy, males and females begin their gender education, learning how to act, think and feel by reference to the masculinity and femininity stories of the community into which they arrive. Although there is considerable diversity among cultures, there is no society anywhere, including high-tech cultures like our own, that does not have gender stories which contain clear and powerful messages about appropriate identities, roles and attitudes for men and women. They are so pervasive, so much a part of everyday life, that we hardly seem to notice them. But we do recognize them, and we do respond to them, at least unconsciously, so that by the time we're old enough to question, these patterns have become so much a part of us, we think of them as our nature. But if we stop the tape, freeze the frame, and carefully examine the signs and symbols that make up a story, it becomes possible to discover the underlying attitudes, the instructions and practices that are woven into every line of the narrative. Such examination frequently reveals patterns of privilege, of power and exploitation that a culture practices so naturally that they somehow feel right. If we look at who the myth makers are, whose stories are being told and by whom, as well as who is ignored and who is silenced altogether, we may begin to understand how even in a free society people can come to accept as common sense even myths and practices that insult them and lead to their abuse. For at least the past 5,000 years, the myth-makers of European Western culture have been men. To a very large extent, even now, in the last decade of the 20th century, we still live in what anthropologists call a patriarchal culture. That is not to say that all men dominate in such a culture. Indeed, many individual men have very little power at all. But is to say that the overwhelming majority of the institutions that shape the lives of ordinary men and women are run by, led by, and dominated by men. In particular, men of privilege, wealth, and power. Even a glance at the leaders in government, religion, scholarly research, art, and the media should leave none of us in any doubt that the folks with the authority to influence the lives of the community are overwhelmingly Caucasian, heterosexual, and male. Their stories that predominate and shape everyone's reality show a universe through the lens of male eyes. Since rich and powerful men have always controlled the myth-generating media, it's always been men who've defined women. It's been men who've been the arbiters of what is acceptable and desirable in women. Women born into such a world must derive their identities and sense of reality from cultural elements they have had only a marginal role in creating. Women must try to find themselves mirrored within a world that for 50 centuries has seen them in terms of male interests and male fantasies. Each of us enters the world from within the body of a woman. Her great power can both sustain us and destroy us. Perhaps this explains why the story of woman has always been one of great ambivalence. In the mythic stories reaching back before history began, woman has been idealized as the earthly embodiment of the Great Mother. At the same time, she has been vilified as her deadly counterpart, Kali the Destroyer. One of the oldest and most enduring myths links woman to birth and to nature. In cultures everywhere, earth goddess stories are common. As Gaia or Mother Nature, woman has symbolized the earth itself. The Demeter cult of ancient Greece believed that the cycle of the seasons was under her control. In the biblical Song of Solomon, parts of the beloved's body are described as plants and food, metaphoric reference to the facts of our early existence. We were all once nourished and sustained from the body and flesh of a woman. To the ancients, a woman's monthly bleeding also seemed to tie even her physiology to the cycles of the natural world. On the other hand, in many of the great origin stories, women are blamed for most of the troubles in the world. Whether as Eve, Lilith, or their Greek sister Pandora, when a scapegoat was needed for the troubles of existence, the finger of blame has been pointed at women. Connection to the earth and to nature was also thought to give women a special relationship with animals. The first domestication of animals was probably done by women. From earliest times to the glossy magazines of today, women are pictured attended by familiars, animals whose wildness has been tamed, their powers brought under her domain. The idea that women have the power to either tame or inflame the beast in man has a long history. It's understandable that in hunter-gatherer or agrarian societies, whose lives are closely tied to the natural cycles of the earth, the power of the earth goddesses to give life, to nourish, and to domesticate and destroy made women, their earthly representatives, awesome indeed. Finding ways to enjoy and utilize the positive aspects of this power without becoming overwhelmed by it or destroyed by it is yet another of the themes of Western patriarchal culture. One response to this ambivalence is to try to have it both ways, neutralizing the threatening aspects of woman by controlling, disguising, or taming her female nature. This was done through the use of strict control. Purification rites, rituals, and taboos, especially focusing on her body, were widespread. Control was also imposed through ideals of beauty, proper behavior, and clothes. Stories of tamed shrews and Eliza Doolittles that chronicle the efforts of some high-born male to transform a naturally wild and unsophisticated girl into a refined and poised lady are a perennial dramatic theme in Western literature. Nature maketh the woman, but clothes maketh the lady. Throughout history, from the friezes of ancient Greece to the fashion magazines of today, we have seen woman used as little more than an easel for clothing and cosmetics. Clothing is used in the service of another ancient myth of femininity, woman the sexual temptress and seductress. Even in the oldest stories of Western culture, like the Sumerian myth of Gilgamesh, we already have woman cast in the familiar role of sexual saboteur, sent to seduce the enemy general before a battle. Men's sexuality has long been seen as unruly and easily aroused, making men easy marks for a sexually attractive woman. Even heroic men, eyes set on lofty transcendent goals, might be distracted from their path through the wiles of an unscrupulous female. Enkidu, Adam, Odysseus, Hercules, John the Baptist, Samson and Julius Caesar are just a few of the mythic heroes brought down through a combination of their own barely containable sexuality and the manipulation of a seductive woman. In the Christian Middle Ages, it was believed that the road to spiritual perfection lay by way of celibacy. Sexual arousal, even thoughts, could bar the gates of heaven. Some of the most woman-hating, misogynistic sentiments anywhere are to be found in the writings of 14th century celibates who resorted to the time-honored tradition of name-calling in their attempts to keep their own sexuality under control. In recent times, a familiar 50s Hollywood plot would include a good girl, bad girl competition for the hero's affection. We knew that if he succumbed, both he and the girl would come to an unsavory end in the final reel. If he avoided the temptation, we could expect the final scene to dispose of the girl and promise him happiness ever after. A superhero like James Bond could have it both ways. Enjoy the sexual attention of the seductress, but remain steadfast in his purpose. He triumphs, she dies. Even in these fast-paced 90s, high school athletic coaches still advise teenage boys not to squander their game power by engaging in sexual behavior the night before a game. Stories and images like these carry the clear imprint of male fear of female sexual power and play on gender antagonisms that echo across millennia. Sex was one form of female power. Magic was another. Because of her connection to the forces of nature, woman has always been thought to have a special access to the occult. The fact that she could bleed once a month but not die seemed magical to people for whom internal bleeding usually meant something was seriously wrong. In some versions, this power was revered as the source of healing and cure. Patients and physicians turned to the Greek healing goddesses Hygeia and Panacea, and throughout history, women have been seen as natural healers. Most of the work of attending to the sick and dying is still done by women, although in most cultures, the highest-ranking healers, the physicians, are men. But woman's supposed connection with the forces of the universe also gave her a special access to the dark forces too, the demons, devils, goblins, and even Satan himself. The fear of women's sexual power and her supposed access to magic resulted in some of the bloodiest, most violent events in Western history, the witch hunts. It is estimated that during the 3 centuries, starting in Germany in the 14th and sweeping all across Europe to England by the 17th, the people tortured, hanged and burned numbered in the millions. 85% of these were illiterate women. Driving the violence was the belief, reinforced by priests, judges, government officials and folklore, that Satan gained access to the world by seducing sexually responsive women and pubescent girls. In exchange, the myth goes, he gave women special magical powers, including knowledge of medicinal plants, healing, and spells. Knowledge of healing, which for millennia had been one of the positive aspects of female power, became perverted into evidence of a woman's diabolical alliance. Women's millennia-old supposed affinity for animals also became incorporated into the witch myth. Domestic cats were seen as incarnations of the beastliest of beasts, Lucifer himself, and the presence of an animal familiar was further indication of an accused woman's unholy agreement. The deep psychological costs of this cultural sadism are still with us. Scary or older women are still referred to as witches, and women who practice various kinds of alternative medicine continue to be the objects of insults and persecution. Counselors frequently hear accounts of women and children being tortured using the same kinds of sadistic methods and obscene name-calling, not much different from the misogyny of the Middle Ages. Perhaps as an antidote to the terror generated by images of fully empowered sexual womanhood, other mythic versions of femininity promoted by patriarchal storymakers construct a reality in the opposite direction. As sexual and powerful women become associated with evil, virtuous and virginal women become idealized. The ideal of femininity becomes a saintly figure who spends her life in prayer, doing good works, and who is entirely devoid of any sexual features whatsoever. Virginity and virtue become highly prized and highly guarded, especially by men. A virtuous daughter could be traded in marriage to build family alliances and fortunes. Or a girl could enter religious life, her dowry going to the church, thereby ensuring ecclesiastical gratitude for her family as well as favor with God. By Victorian times, sexuality had become associated with vigor and masculinity. To avoid any hints of mannishness then, Victorian middle-class women cultivated a look of physical frailty. This fetishization of weakness reached its peak where tubercular women and invalids were considered highly attractive and often became the object of obsessive erotic attention. Women starved themselves and avoided activities that would make them look too healthy. They restricted their bodies in tight-fitting clothing. They were so tightly bound that they would often swoon at the first sign of excitement, winning the hearts of many a Victorian male only too eager to play hero. This trend eventually attained a somewhat necrophiliac extreme, where images of dead women, like the drowned Ophelia or the Lady of Shalott, became the high culture erotica of the era. The late 19th century fetish with frailty, even death, the ultimate harmless female, is mirrored today in movies like Love Story, where the erotic interest is a dying girl. It is particularly evident in high fashion, where the ideal model is rail thin. Anorexia and bulimia are now epidemic amongst middle-class 90s women as today's women replay the deathly scripts that once crippled their great-grandmothers. If Victorian women were to be sexual at all, it had to be within the context of marriage and for the sole purpose of perpetuating the dynasty. Even married women kept their pregnancies hidden so as not to advertise the fact of their sexual activity. As recently as the early 1960s, female professions like teaching and nursing routinely prohibited married women from working, suggesting that once they begin to engage in sexual relationships, even with a lawfully wedded husband, women somehow became tainted. There are still schools in America that terminate a woman's contract when her pregnancy begins to show. By the beginning of the 20th century, the acceptable cultural image of women, whose awesome power had so terrified earlier generations of men, had been reduced to either inert, sexless waif or baby-producing angel of the home. Nowhere are the instructions as to the appropriate roles for males and females more clear than in the tales of heroism and adventure. Some of our finest human qualities are coded into the heroic myths of our culture. And more than any other, the heroic stories instruct us on the acceptable relationships between men and women. Clearly, explicitly, and unwaveringly, males are cast as heroes and villains, and the role of victim in distress is given to females. Every boy knows that when the going gets tough, he must get going, whether or not he feels up to it. Every girl knows she is supposed to wait to be rescued. He learns that fear or asking for help is unmanly. She learns that independence or acting on her own behalf is not feminine. Odysseus adventures while his wife waits. Warriors fight other men in foreign lands on behalf of women and children left behind. Boys face down dangers while girls scream. And heroic men face wicked men to keep helpless women from harm. The message is clear. Ideal women are passive, domestic, male-dependent, and weak. The ideal male is courageous, strong, heterosexual, hard-working, and lives an independent life of action and power. It isn't hard to figure out how this view of reality serves to maintain the status quo in male-female relations, and how women are set up to be victims and men to be the aggressors. The Victorian version of femininity became firmly entrenched. At the idealized pinnacle of womanhood, there was no room for female sexuality. Fearing that they would be drawn into situations of shame and dishonor, many women repressed sexual feelings altogether. This led Victorian doctors like Freud to conclude that women's mature sexuality was to be realized only through marriage and motherhood. According to Freud, unless a woman gave birth to a child, preferably a son, she could never achieve her fullness as a woman. It was part of a man's responsibility, then, to ensure that his wife achieved her destiny. In the face of her chaste reluctance, a little coercion was conscionable, even by respectable men. Marriage advice of the era encouraged women to be grateful if their husbands were forceful enough to break through their natural resistance. Even some of Freud's female followers, like Helene Deutsch, suggested that a certain amount of masochism was natural in girls and served to ensure that they would seek out the pain of sexual penetration and childbirth. The concept of the therapeutic rape captured the fantasies of the Victorian middle class, as husbands were urged to impose their sexual agendas even in the face of female refusal. Images of raped Sabines, maidens in sexual slavery and bondage, were a popular motif in Victorian art. Even today, not all states will consider forced sex by a husband as rape. Fighting the passage of such legislation in 1979, California State Senator Bob Wilson asked, "If a man cannot rape his wife, who can he rape?" It is still commonplace to suggest that all women secretly long to be raped. The myth of therapeutic rape also persists in the practice of psychotherapy itself. A recent study of sexual abuse of female patients by male psychiatrists found that male therapists who reported multiple sexual encounters with patients often justified their activities by suggesting that the sex was therapeutic and helped women overcome their inhibitions. Over the generations, myths like these have led to the division of women into two distinct and separate camps. The dichotomy of good girl, bad girl, Madonna, whore, faithful wife and mother versus sexually experienced mistress is played out daily in films, books, soap operas, advertising, and magazines. The plot is predictable. The good girl gets home and husband, the bad girl ends up abused, cast out, alone, or dead, with the clear implication that she has only herself to blame. Once internalized and part of the deepest feelings and expectations, and shared by virtually everyone in the community, these myths become self-perpetuating, part of the normal or automatic repertoire of behaviors of men and women. If a man isn't brave enough, his humiliation and rejection is inevitable. He must act tough and assert his dominance. If an unmarried woman is too sexually forward or independent, she deserves and must expect the worst. She must act innocent and submissive and disguise any authentic sexual interests she might have. Once she becomes some man's woman, she is obliged to become sexual, but only with him. Virgin and whore, hero and dominator, the two of them, guided by internalized versions of centuries-old patterns of maleness and femaleness, play out reliable and familiar roles in the gender drama. Through centuries of internalization and community enforcement, what began as mythic versions of masculinity and femininity have come to define what is normal and natural. Held in deep psychological structures of both men and women, they establish and maintain what is felt as real, proper, arousing, and desirable. Societies understandably have a very large stake in maintaining stability in such important aspects of life. Those with power are especially invested in the maintenance of the status quo. So even though over time expressions of maleness and femaleness have mutated in some ways, the basic power relationship between the sexes has changed very little. Whether our mythic male battles dragons, enemies of the nation, or opposing counsel, and whether our mythic female is Donna Reed or Jezebel or both, the basic pattern of male dominance and female subordination has remained unaltered for over 100 generations, and it has wrought a terrible price in female suffering and gender violence. Rape, sexual harassment, and incest are frequently explained by reference to these millennia-old gender stories that lead both men and women to believe that somehow sexual exploitation of females by males, even if reprehensible, is nonetheless somehow natural. It often takes massive media attention before people begin to recognize that many widely tolerated gender patterns are in fact damaging and abusive. Workplace sexual harassment of subordinates, usually women, by superiors, usually male, is a case in point. The controversy surrounding the sexual harassment charges made by Anita Hill during the confirmation hearings for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas made it crystal clear that behavior that may be a routine part of male-female relationships on the job are in fact experienced by the subordinate as abusive and degrading. Her lower place in the dominance hierarchy requires that if she is to safeguard her career, she must acquiesce to unwelcome male attentions or risk public humiliation and loss of status. After the Senate hearings made the issue public, women all over America began to speak out about the epidemic levels of abusive behaviors and attitudes towards women in the workplace. And these attitudes begin early. In a 1989 study of junior high school boys and girls, for example, all of them knew that forced sex was not acceptable. But when a situation was described in which a girl had accepted an expensive dinner and had accompanied the boy to his college room afterwards, over half the boys and just under half the girls said they felt forced sex would be justified. In another study, the majority of the boys surveyed said that they would force a girl into sex if they thought they could get away with it. Date rapes and gang rapes are now very common, especially in communities like military towns and college campuses, where men have opportunities to gather in alcohol-mediated single-sex groups. Abusive behavior by males is frequently encouraged, applauded, and normalized in such groups. These deeply ingrained patterns of misogyny are also very much in evidence in the epidemic of women being beaten by husbands or lovers. Some estimates suggest that as many as 4,700 women every day are beaten by their male partners. Not infrequently, these women are seriously injured and sometimes killed. Often the event that precipitates the violence is one in which, in the mind of the perpetrator at least, traditional gender attitudes are at stake. Sexual jealousy or suspicions of infidelity are the most frequent excuse for the violence. Verbal abuse and name-calling often accompanies the beatings, leaving the women in no doubt as to the gender nature of the assault. Women who are battered and remain with their abuser often are women who identify most strongly with the ideal of female dependence and submission, and male strength and dominance. It's frequently men who identify strongly with traditional ideas of macho masculinity who resort to violence. Encouraged by the culture that it's man's role to dominate, such men may strike out when they see their dominance threatened. And it is critical that we understand that this resort to violence is not just an individual response of some maladjusted and atypical male. This kind of response is normative and actively supported by the patriarchal culture as a whole. In Brazil, it was August 1991 before the Supreme Court declared it illegal for a man to murder his adulterous wife. A woman, on the other hand, is encouraged to stand by her man and to rely on him to support and protect her. She doubts her own ability to make it on her own and to fend for herself and her children in a world that wasn't designed with women heads of households in mind. Battered women's counselors frequently speak to both men and women who have internalized the idea that women need and indeed want to be disciplined by their husbands. It's often not until her traditional identity as protector of her children comes into open conflict with her other traditional identity as dependent and long-suffering helpmeet, when her husband turns his violence against the children too, that she finally makes the decision to run for safety. Addictions also show gender-specific patterns. Women typically become addicted by going along with the drug use of someone they love. Men more typically first take drugs looking for adventure, trying to impress someone or to improve their performance. As we proceed down the familiar list of serious social ills, gang behavior, AIDS transmission, street violence, ethnic intolerance, and so on, we will see in all of them long-standing patterns of attitudes and responses that come out of the myths and stories that surround our every waking moment. So what's the solution? If these patterns have been part of our personal and community identity for so long, does this not suggest, as traditionalists assert, that they're indelible and inevitably part of male-female relations? Are they not hardwired into our very biology? Throughout this program, we've proceeded from the assumption that what we know as masculinity and femininity are social constructions. We've suggested, and there is very powerful historical and cross-cultural evidence to support it, that there is an enormously wide range of behaviors that are considered, by at least some humans on this planet, as male and female. In some cultures, what we consider masculine is considered feminine. Worldwide, 85% of the heavy labor is done by women. Americans consider women the emotional sex, while some Middle Eastern peoples believe the opposite. Margaret Mead reported that the Manus were convinced that only men enjoyed playing with babies. Medieval men thought women were oversexed. Victorians thought they were frigid. So, even though it's quite obvious that babies are born to one kind of human that have been impregnated by the other, beyond that, most gender behavior in humans seems to be a matter of culture, not biology. We construct our sense of who we are as men and women from the symbols and stories our culture provides us after we arrive. It becomes a matter of great significance then what symbols and stories a culture offers its youngsters, and who produces them. Until the last 50 or so years, the stories of gender identity, whether mythic, religious, scientific or literary, have been created out of the male psyche. How else could stories have grown up that suggest that women consort with Lucifer, are the weaker sex, have no sexual feelings, or that they long to be raped? As the young girl begins to construct her identity, how is she to find herself in stories created with others' interests in mind? We must finally accept that we are all responsible for the stories our community tells our children. We have the power to inform and shape the minds, lives, even the inner selves of our citizens to a far deeper and more fundamental level than we ever thought. We are responsible for whether we create people capable of relationships of respect and mutuality, or whether we continue to produce both boys and girls who think gender exploitation and abuse is a normal part of life. Thanks to the political, educational, and reproductive freedoms gained over the last generation, patriarchy is finally being dismantled. Technological advances like computers, video cameras, and VCRs are giving ordinary women access to the myth-making process. For the first time, women and girls can hear and tell of their own actual experiences of womanhood and not be forced to shape themselves into male fantasies. Women are beginning to tell each other about their experiences, both good and bad, as women, mothers, daughters, lovers, scientists, and artists. Now women can generate their own stories, new myths that can heal and comfort the millennia-old pain, and that can ennoble and inspire. And we know women-generated stories will be different. They might, for example, tell men how women really feel about rape, how they feel living life as the second sex, or about domestic and sexual servitude, pornographic exploitation, and disrespect. Women might retell the stories of domestic abuse, for example. Instead of suggesting that a woman is somehow masochistic if she's reluctant to leave a violent spouse, perhaps some women's stories would recognize the heroism in staying in a dangerous situation to protect one's children. If women could see other women as heroes, perhaps they would have the self-confidence to reject a potential partner at the first signs of abuse. And if men saw women as heroes, perhaps they wouldn't be so quick to rape, harass, or assault. As women come to know themselves and each other through their own authentic experience, they may gain a new sense of empowerment and self-esteem. By using the expanded cultural access now available to them and contributing their voices to the community conversation about maleness and femaleness, women might bring about a truce in the 5,000-year-old battle of the sexes. For the first time in longer than history can remember, we might all discover ways of being in relationships that are mutually caring and respectful, and in which every participant, female or male, may be free to realize their fullest human possibilities. Do these children and their children deserve anything less?